Pride and Prejudice. The story begins in the quiet countryside of Hertfordshire, England, where the Bennet family resides at their modest estate, Longbourn. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have 5 daughters: Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. With no male heir, the estate is entailed to their cousin, Mr. Collins, creating a pressing need for the Bennet daughters to marry well. Mrs. Bennet is particularly zealous in her matchmaking efforts. The arrival of a wealthy bachelor, Mr. Charles Bingley, renting the nearby estate of Netherfield Park, sets the village abuzz. Bingley is amiable and approachable, making him an instant favorite. He brings along his sisters, Caroline and Louisa, and his reserved friend, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. At the Marathon Ball, Bingley charms the room, particularly Jane Bennet, with whom he shares an instant and mutual attraction. However, Mr. Darcy's prideful demeanor and refusal to dance offend the locals. When Elizabeth overhears him dismissing her as tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, her opinion of him solidifies into dislike. Jane and Bingley's growing affection. Jane visits Netherfield to further her acquaintance with Bingley, but her stay is extended when she falls ill. Elizabeth, ever protective of her sister, walks through the muddy countryside to tend to her, shocking the genteel company at Netherfield with her appearance. Darcy, however, begins to admire Elizabeth's wit and vitality. Despite his growing attraction, his reserved nature prevents him from expressing his feelings. Meanwhile, Mr. Bennet receives a letter from Mr. Collins, who announces his intention to visit Longbourn. Mr. Collins is a pompous and obsequious clergyman, recently given a parish under the patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Mr. Darcy's aunt. His visit is motivated by a desire to marry one of the Bennet daughters, thereby compensating for his eventual inheritance of Longbourn. The arrival of Mr. Wickham. During this time, the Bennet family meets Mr. George Wickham, a handsome and charming militia officer stationed in Meryton. Wickham shares with Elizabeth a troubling story about Darcy, claiming that Darcy denied him a valuable inheritance. This tale confirms Elizabeth's negative opinion of Darcy, and she feels justified in her dislike of him. At the Netherfield Ball, Elizabeth is surprised when Darcy asks her to dance. Their conversation during the dance is filled with tension and sarcasm, further fueling Elizabeth's perception of Darcy as arrogant and condescending. Meanwhile, Jane and Bingley's budding relationship appears to thrive, but Bingley's sisters subtly express their disapproval of the Bennet family's lack of sophistication and propriety. Mr. Collins's proposal. Soon after the ball, Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, believing he offers her a desirable match as the future heir of Longbourn. Elizabeth, valuing personal happiness over financial security, firmly rejects him, much to her mother's distress. Offended but undeterred, Mr. Collins quickly turns his attention to Elizabeth's friend, Charlotte Lucas. Practical and pragmatic, Charlotte accepts his proposal, prioritizing financial stability over romantic ideals. Elizabeth is disheartened by her friend's decision, but respects her reasoning. Bingley's departure and Darcy's role. To Elizabeth's dismay, Bingley abruptly leaves Netherfield for London, cutting off contact with Jane. Jane is heartbroken, but remains composed, refusing to dwell on her disappointment. Elizabeth suspects that Bingley's sisters and Darcy played a role in separating him from Jane, believing they looked down on the Bennet family. Elizabeth visits Charlotte at her new home in Kent, where Mr. Collins is now comfortably settled. Their home is near Rosings Park, the grand estate of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. During her visit, Elizabeth unexpectedly encounters Darcy, who is visiting his aunt. Lady Catherine's domineering personality and condescension toward Elizabeth only strengthen her dislike for Darcy's social circle. Darcy's first proposal. To Elizabeth's astonishment, Darcy confesses his love for her and proposes marriage, despite emphasizing the inferiority of her family and the social obstacles between them. Elizabeth is offended by his arrogance and rejects him outright, accusing him of sabotaging Jane's relationship with Bingley and mistreating Wickham. Darcy, stunned by her response, leaves but later delivers a letter to Elizabeth explaining his actions. In the letter, Darcy admits to discouraging Bingley's attachment to Jane, believing her affections were not strong. He also reveals Wickham's true character, recounting how Wickham attempted to elope with Darcy's younger sister, Georgiana, to gain her fortune. Elizabeth is shocked and begins to reconsider her judgments, realizing she may have been too quick to trust Wickham and condemn Darcy. Elizabeth's tour of Pemberley months later, Elizabeth accompanies her aunt and uncle, the Gardiners, on a tour of Derbyshire, where they visit Darcy's estate, Pemberley. Elizabeth is impressed by the grandeur of the estate and the respect Darcy commands from his staff. To her surprise, Darcy is at home and greets her warmly, showing none of the resentment she expected. He extends his hospitality to the Gardiners, and Elizabeth begins to see a kinder, more considerate side of him. During this visit, Elizabeth meets Georgiana Darcy, who is shy but sweet, and observes the affection Darcy shows toward his sister. These interactions challenge Elizabeth's previous assumptions about Darcy's character and intentions. Lydia's scandal. The Bennet family's peace is shattered when news arrives that Lydia has eloped with Wickham. The couple's reckless behavior threatens to ruin the family's reputation, as it is unclear whether Wickham intends to marry Lydia. Elizabeth is mortified, knowing this scandal could damage Jane's and her own prospects. Darcy, upon learning of the situation, quietly takes it upon himself to resolve the matter. He locates Lydia and Wickham in London and convinces Wickham to marry Lydia by paying off his debts and securing him a commission in the army. Darcy keeps his involvement secret, but Elizabeth eventually learns the truth from her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner. She is deeply moved by Darcy's generosity and willingness to protect her family's honor. Jane and Bingley's engagement with Lydia married, and the scandal contained, Bingley returns to Netherfield and resumes his courtship of Jane. He proposes, and Jane joyfully accepts, much to the delight of the entire Bennet family. Darcy's role in reuniting the couple becomes evident, further softening Elizabeth's feelings toward him. Elizabeth and Darcy's resolution, Darcy visits Longbourn and proposes to Elizabeth again, this time with humility and sincerity. Elizabeth, having come to admire and love Darcy, accepts his proposal. Their union represents the triumph of love and mutual respect over pride and prejudice.